The ballroom was dazzling. From the moment the guests arrived, they were enveloped by a world of opulence. Every corner sparkled with golden accents. Chandeliers cast a warm glow over the crowd, and the air was filled with the sound of soft jazz playing in the background. It was a night of celebration, hosted by one of the wealthiest and most influential families in the world. The event was a charity gala, and every detail had been meticulously planned. The guests were a mix of famous faces, high-powered executives, and influential leaders from all corners of society. Yet, amid the glitz and glamour, there was a strange undercurrent of tension, almost unnoticeable at first, but it was there. People whispered quietly, their voices barely rising above the hum of the crowd. At the heart of the gala, sitting at one of the most elegant tables, was the billionaire's son. He was a young man in his early 20s, well-dressed in a dark tuxedo that complemented the room's sophisticated atmosphere. His hair was neatly combed, his face handsome, but there was something about him that made others uneasy. His eyes were hidden behind a pair of dark sunglasses, despite the fact that the room was filled with soft, warm light. To anyone observing, it was clear the young man was blind. His presence at the event, while impressive due to his family's wealth and reputation, seemed to make the guests uncertain. People didn't know how to approach him. They didn't know what to say. Some stared at him awkwardly, unsure of how to behave, while others went out of their way to avoid looking in his direction altogether. A few of the guests whispered behind their hands, making remarks about how difficult it must be for someone with a disability to live such a privileged life. Their words were soft but cutting, yet despite all the stares and murmurs, the young man remained calm and composed. He sat with his family, listening to the sounds of the event, and occasionally his father would lean in to speak with him. He didn't seem bothered by the gossip or the uneasy glances. Instead, he seemed to have grown used to it, this quiet judgment of others who didn't fully understand him. One woman, seated across the room, watched him carefully. She wasn't a regular guest at such events. In fact, she wasn't part of the elite circles that usually frequented these kinds of galas. Emily had been invited to the event by a friend who worked in the industry, but she wasn't used to the world of luxury and status that surrounded her now. She had always worked hard for everything she had, and had little interest in the extravagant world that seemed to exist so far beyond her own. But tonight, as she sat at her table, her attention kept drifting back to the young man in the dark sunglasses. She had heard rumors about him, the blind son of the billionaire. People said he was difficult, arrogant, and even unapproachable. Some claimed that he didn't care for the events he was forced to attend. Others whispered that he was somewhat cold, hiding behind his blindness to create distance from the world around him. Emily didn't know if any of it was true, but what she did know was that something about the way people were reacting to him made her uncomfortable. She had spent most of her life trying to avoid being the subject of gossip and judgment. In a world where people were quick to make assumptions based on appearances, she understood what it felt like to be misunderstood. And so she couldn't help but feel sympathy for the young man. She wondered what it would be like to live in a world where everyone looked at you differently because of something you couldn't change. How hard must it be to walk into a room full of people who don't know how to treat you? She imagined that it was more exhausting than anything else, just trying to get through each event without the discomfort of being treated as though you were somehow different. As the evening went on, Emily noticed the subtle ways in which the young man was ignored. There was a conversation happening across the room about a new charity initiative, and he was seated at the center of the group, yet no one was directing their conversation toward him. It was as if they were afraid to speak to him directly, as though his blindness made him invisible. The silence that filled the space around him was deafening. Eventually, Emily stood up, excusing herself from her table. She wasn't sure why she felt so compelled to do it, but she made her way across the room toward him. As she got closer, she could feel the subtle tension in the air shift. The guests seemed to part, making way for her, but she didn't pay them any attention. Her focus was solely on the young man who was sitting quietly, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table, his face relaxed but distant. When she reached his table, she hesitated for a moment. She wasn't sure how to introduce herself or what to say, but then she reminded herself that he was just a person, like anyone else. He wasn't defined by his disability, and he wasn't defined by the rumors that followed him. He was simply a man in need of a friendly conversation, someone who probably spent too much of his life alone in crowded rooms, left to his own thoughts. "Excuse me," Emily said gently, her voice calm but clear. "I hope I'm not interrupting." The young man's head turned slightly toward her, and Emily saw the faint movement of his lips as he smiled. He hadn't heard her approach, but he had sensed her presence. He nodded slightly, acknowledging her. "Not at all," he replied, his voice steady and warm. "Mind if I join you for a moment?" Emily asked, not waiting for an answer before she gently pulled out the chair beside him and sat down. The young man tilted his head slightly in her direction, his sunglasses still in place, but his posture seemed to relax ever so slightly. "I'd be happy for the company," he said, and Emily could tell that he meant it. His voice didn't have the sharpness that some had described to her. It was soft and genuine. For a few moments they simply sat in companionable silence. Emily didn't feel the need to fill the space with awkward chatter. Instead, she allowed herself to enjoy the quiet, and she could sense that the young man appreciated it. It wasn't long before she asked him a question. "What brings you to a gala like this?" she asked, genuinely curious. He chuckled softly. "My father. He's the one hosting it," he said. "I'm supposed to be part of the glamorous scene, I suppose, but I've never really fit into it." Emily raised an eyebrow. "And why's that?" He shifted slightly in his seat, his face turning more toward her. "Because people don't know how to act around me. They're afraid of making a mistake, so they don't talk to me at all." Emily felt a pang of sympathy. It was exactly what she had been noticing. She could hear the frustration in his voice, the weariness that came from years of feeling like an outsider. "That must be lonely," she said softly. "It's easier to stay in the background," he replied, shrugging. "But sometimes I wish people would just treat me like anyone else." Emily smiled, feeling a connection to him. "I get it. People can be so quick to judge when they don't understand something." He nodded, a quiet understanding passing between them. "Exactly. It's like I'm invisible sometimes. But that's okay. I've learned to live with it." For a few more moments they simply sat together, the sounds of the gala drifting around them. It wasn't until the sound of applause began to fill the room that Emily realized the evening was about to take another turn. The energy in the room shifted, and the guests began to stand, murmuring excitedly. Something was about to happen. The young man turned his head toward the stage, a small frown tugging at his lips. He wasn't particularly looking forward to whatever was coming next, but Emily could tell that he was prepared for it. Whatever it was, it would likely feel like another moment of discomfort. Another instance where he'd be treated like an object of curiosity rather than a person. But Emily, seated beside him, felt a quiet determination rise within her. Maybe tonight she could do something different. Maybe she could make him feel like he wasn't just a name or a rumor, but someone worth noticing. She didn't know yet what that might look like, but she knew she couldn't just sit by and let him fade into the background. As the applause grew louder, she stood up and turned toward him, her voice calm but firm. "Do you want to go up to the stage?" she asked. He looked at her in surprise, then nodded. "I think that might be the only way to change the mood around here." With a smile, Emily offered her arm to him, and just like that, the world around them seemed to pause, waiting for what would happen next. Emily offered the young man her arm, and though there was a brief moment of hesitation, he accepted her gesture. The crowd around them was still buzzing, but in that instant it felt like the noise faded away. It was just the two of them, standing on the edge of a moment that could change everything. She guided him gently, walking at a steady pace. His hand rested lightly on her arm, his fingertips brushing the fabric of her dress. It was a small contact, but it meant a great deal to him. He had grown used to being handled with caution, as though everyone around him was afraid of doing something wrong. But Emily didn't treat him with that same hesitation. She treated him like a person, not a puzzle to be solved. As they walked toward the stage, Emily couldn't help but notice the shift in the atmosphere. People's eyes followed them, and she could feel the tension in the air. There were murmurs, soft conversations starting up again as guests noticed the pair making their way through the ballroom. They had seen the young man with his family before, but never like this. Never with someone else by his side, someone who was guiding him with confidence and without hesitation. The closer they got to the stage, the more aware Emily became of the curious stares. She knew what people were thinking. They were probably surprised that someone had the audacity to approach him so freely. The whispers had already started to swirl around the room, some subtle, others more obvious. He's blind, right? What does she think she's doing? Someone murmured from across the room. Emily didn't need to look to know they were talking about her and the young man, but she didn't care. She kept her focus straight ahead, leading him gently toward the stairs that would take them to the stage. She could feel his slight tension in the way his grip tightened on her arm, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he trusted her. As they reached the base of the stage, Emily paused for a moment, letting him adjust to the height of the steps. She could hear the soft shuffle of his feet as he moved, and she held her breath for a second, hoping everything would go smoothly. "You're doing great," she said quietly, her voice full of encouragement. "Thanks," he replied, his voice a little stronger now, a little more confident. Together, they made their way up the stairs. Emily was aware of every step he took, ensuring that he was steady and supported. The room seemed to hold its breath as they ascended to the stage, the moment feeling almost surreal. When they finally reached the top, she gently released his arm, stepping aside so he could stand on his own. The young man paused, standing tall. He adjusted his sunglasses slightly, his posture straightening. Emily could sense the shift in his energy. He wasn't just standing there as the object of quiet curiosity anymore. He was standing there because he had earned the right to be seen, to be heard. The applause started slowly, hesitantly, but then grew louder. It wasn't for her, but she could feel the warmth of it, the appreciation that had shifted from whispering judgment to genuine admiration. The guests in the room had witnessed something they hadn't expected. They had witnessed someone treating the young man like a human being, with respect and without pity. As the applause continued, the young man turned slightly toward Emily. He didn't say anything at first, but the expression on his face told her everything. It was a look of gratitude, of someone who had been seen for who they truly were, not just the label attached to them. The lights on the stage were bright, and for a moment Emily felt like they were the only two people in the room. She had done what others hadn't dared to do. She had stepped into the silence and broken it. The young man cleared his throat and stepped forward, addressing the audience. His voice rang out clear and steady, but there was a slight tremor to it, a vulnerability that he couldn't quite hide. "Good evening," he began, his voice strong but filled with an emotion that surprised even him. "I know some of you may be wondering why I'm here standing in front of you tonight. I know that for most of you I'm a stranger, but I want to tell you about something important to me." Emily stood back, watching him. She had always known that people who had to fight for their place in the world often had the most to say. She could sense that the young man was not just speaking to the crowd but to himself as well. This wasn't just about the charity or the gala. This was about him making a choice to be seen, to take control of his own narrative. "I'm here because of my work," he continued, his hand gripping the microphone a little tighter. "But more importantly, I'm here because I want to make a difference. Not just because of who I am or who my family is, but because I believe in something. Something that goes beyond the money, beyond the status." The audience was quiet now, hanging on his every word. Emily could feel their attention shift entirely. It was as though the young man had suddenly stepped out from the shadows and into the light, not as a spectacle, but as a person with a real voice. "I've spent much of my life feeling like people saw me only for what I couldn't do. But what I've realized is that the way people treat you is just as important as what you can do. I'm here to show you that I'm more than just someone you feel sorry for. I'm someone with ideas, with a future, with a purpose." The words seemed to resonate, echoing through the ballroom. Emily watched as people began to nod in agreement. There were no more whispers, no more judgments, just respect. The young man paused for a moment, taking a deep breath before he continued. "And I owe a lot of this to the people who see me, not just as the blind son of a billionaire, but as a person. So I want to thank those who have helped me along the way. And to those who haven't, I hope this can be a reminder. We all deserve to be seen, truly seen, for who we are." As he finished speaking, the applause was thunderous. It wasn't polite clapping. It wasn't the kind of applause you give out of obligation. It was real, heartfelt recognition. The kind of applause that spoke of a shift, a change in perception. Emily smiled to herself, standing a little off to the side, content in the knowledge that she had been part of this moment. She had helped guide him, not just physically, but in a way that allowed him to step into his own light. She had given him a chance to be heard, and he had seized it with both hands. When the applause finally began to die down, the young man turned to Emily. This time, his expression was different. There was no distance in his eyes, no coldness. He looked at her as though he truly saw her, as though he had finally realized that there was something in this world that he hadn't known before. Connection. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice sincere. "I couldn't have done this without you." Emily nodded, her smile warm and genuine. "You didn't need me," she said softly. "You just needed someone to see you, and that's something no one can take away." For the first time that night, the young man felt like he wasn't just the blind son of a billionaire. He was someone with his own identity, his own purpose. And as he stood there on the stage under the bright lights, he knew this was only the beginning of a new chapter. After the speech, the young man stepped down from the stage with a newfound sense of pride. The room had fallen into a deep silence as he spoke, and the applause that followed was unlike any he had experienced before. It was as if the entire atmosphere of the gala had shifted. People who had once whispered behind his back now watched him with genuine respect. He had no idea what to expect from the night, but one thing was clear: something had changed. Emily stood to the side, watching the crowd around her. She had known this moment would be significant, but she hadn't realized just how much of an impact it would have. As people approached the young man, offering congratulations and kind words, Emily quietly stepped away, letting him have his space. She wasn't sure where this unexpected connection would lead, but she was glad she had been part of his journey, even if just for a moment. She found a seat at one of the nearby tables away from the crowd. She hadn't come to the gala expecting to meet anyone, let alone play a part in someone's life in such a profound way, yet it felt right to have done so. There was something deeply satisfying about seeing someone treated with the dignity they deserved, especially when that person had spent so much of their life in the shadows. As the evening wore on, Emily noticed that the once distant figure of the young man was now surrounded by a group of guests, many of whom were eager to speak with him. His father was by his side, occasionally offering a word or two of encouragement, but it was clear that tonight his son had come into his own. Emily watched as he engaged with the others, his confidence building with every conversation. He was no longer the object of pity that some people had seen him as earlier in the night. He was just a man, like any other, capable of creating change, of making a difference. At one point, she saw him glance in her direction. There was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, and a small smile played at the corners of his lips. She smiled back, giving him a small nod. It was a silent acknowledgement, a moment of shared understanding. He had stepped out of his shell, and so had she in her own way. They had both pushed past the boundaries that others had set for them. Later in the evening, the music swelled and the lights dimmed. It was time for dancing. The guests, many of whom had been quietly judging or avoiding the young man earlier, now mingled freely. The room buzzed with energy, and Emily found herself caught up in the atmosphere, swept along by the movement of the crowd. She didn't know how long she had been sitting alone, lost in thought, but it felt good to be part of something. As the first few couples moved to the dance floor, Emily's attention was drawn back to the young man. He had stepped away from the group of guests and was now standing at the edge of the room, looking out over the floor. He seemed a little unsure, hesitant, but there was something different about the way he held himself now. He didn't seem as isolated as he had before. Emily's eyes followed him for a moment. He wasn't trying to blend into the background anymore. He was just there. A part of the evening, a part of the world around him. Without really thinking, Emily stood up and walked toward him. There was no plan, no grand gesture in her mind. She just felt an urge to approach him, to offer him the chance to be part of this next step in the evening's journey. The music played on, filling the space with a soft, rhythmic beat. But Emily's focus remained on the young man standing by the edge of the room. When she reached him, she didn't say anything at first. She simply stood beside him, her presence a quiet offering of support. The young man turned toward her, a slight smile crossing his face. "Enjoying the night?" Emily asked softly. He nodded, though his expression remained thoughtful. "It's different now," he said quietly, as if he were still trying to process everything that had happened. "I don't know if I'll ever get used to this," Emily smiled. "You don't have to get used to it," she replied. "You just have to live it." The young man gave a small chuckle, shaking his head. "That's easier said than done," he muttered, but his voice held less uncertainty than before. "I've spent my whole life feeling like I didn't belong, and now it feels like the world has changed overnight." Emily glanced toward the dance floor. The couples were moving in perfect synchrony, the lights catching the sparkle of the crystal chandeliers overhead. It was an image of grace and elegance, but there was also something about it that seemed out of reach for him. She understood why he might feel hesitant. "You know," she said, "it's not always about belonging. It's about finding your place, even if it's not what others expect it to be." He raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "And where is that place?" Emily looked out over the ballroom, taking in the elegant chaos. "It's wherever you decide it is. It doesn't have to fit anyone's idea of what it should be." The young man seemed to consider her words, his gaze drifting back to the dance floor. There was a long pause before he spoke again. "Would you dance with me?" he asked, his voice tentative but sincere. Emily was taken aback by the request. She hadn't expected this, but something about the way he asked made her smile. He wasn't asking out of pity or obligation. He was simply offering a chance for connection, for something real. She looked at him for a moment, then nodded. "I'd be happy to," she said. He stepped forward, offering his arm with a slight nervousness in his movements. It was as if he had already accepted the uncertainty that came with the moment, but it was still a step toward something new. Emily took his arm, and together they made their way toward the center of the floor. As they reached the dance floor, the music shifted into a slower, more intimate rhythm. The guests who were dancing had already formed a loose circle, leaving the middle open. Emily stood there for a moment, feeling the warmth of the surrounding crowd, but the young man seemed unfazed by the attention. He was focused on the music, focused on the moment they were sharing. With careful, deliberate steps, they began to move together. Emily could feel his hesitance at first, the slight tension in his shoulders as he tried to match her pace. She kept her steps slow, steady, giving him time to adjust. He wasn't as fluid as the other dancers, but there was something beautiful in the way he followed her lead. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. They moved in silence, the music carrying them through the steps. At first there was a certain awkwardness, but as the dance went on, that feeling faded. The young man's movements grew more confident, more fluid. It wasn't about dancing in the conventional sense. It was about finding a rhythm together, about sharing the experience in a way that didn't require perfection. As they swayed together, Emily felt a sense of connection, not just between them, but with the entire room. There was something about this moment that felt timeless, a shared understanding between two people who had once felt disconnected from the world around them. The whispers had long since faded, replaced by an unspoken admiration. The music played on, but for Emily and the young man, it wasn't just about the notes or the steps. It was about the simple act of being seen, of being part of something bigger than themselves. And in that moment, they both knew that they had stepped into a new chapter, a chapter where they could be seen, truly seen for who they were. The evening was winding down and the energy in the room had shifted. The guests had settled into small groups, laughing and talking, sipping wine and enjoying the soft hum of conversation. The music had softened, and the once crowded dance floor was now a quiet space with only a few couples lingering in the center. Emily stood off to the side, watching the scene unfold. It had been a night of surprises, and though the event was coming to a close, she had the feeling that things were far from over. The young man, who had once seemed so distant, now moved through the crowd with ease. His father was nearby, speaking to a group of influential donors, but the young man no longer appeared disconnected from the world around him. He seemed confident, engaged, even a little playful. There was a lightness in his step that hadn't been there when the night began, and Emily couldn't help but smile as she watched him. He had found his place, even if just for tonight. As the evening drew to a close, the lights above the dance floor dimmed slightly, casting a softer glow over the guests. The guests who had once felt so unsure of how to treat him were now approaching him with smiles and easy conversation. The whispers that had followed him through the evening were replaced by laughter and genuine interest. He was no longer the subject of silent judgment, but someone people wanted to be around, and for the first time, Emily saw that he was enjoying it. It was only then that she realized how much the night had meant to him. She had seen the uncertainty in his eyes when they first met, the hesitance that came from years of feeling like an outsider. But now, as he conversed with guests, laughing and exchanging stories, she could see a new sense of belonging in him. It was as if the world had shifted, even if just for a few hours. He wasn't defined by his blindness anymore. He wasn't just the son of a billionaire. He was someone with ideas, with stories, with a presence that demanded attention, not out of pity but out of respect. Emily hadn't come to the gala expecting to make a difference in anyone's life. She hadn't known she would be the one to change the course of this young man's evening, perhaps even his life. But in some quiet, simple way she had, and that realization sat with her quietly as she watched him from across the room, surrounded by new friends, his confidence growing with each passing moment. She didn't need to be part of every conversation, every interaction. She was content to watch from a distance, knowing that what she had done earlier that night, offering her arm, guiding him to the stage, had been the start of something meaningful. It had been the beginning of him stepping out of the shadows, of realizing that he was more than just an invisible figure in the crowd. As the final moments of the evening approached, the young man made his way back toward Emily, weaving through the crowd with ease. He looked different now, relaxed, comfortable in his own skin. He had shed the hesitance that had defined him earlier, and in its place was a quiet confidence. When he reached her, he gave her a small smile. "I think I owe you an apology," he said, his voice light. For how I was earlier. I didn't really give you much of a chance to speak, did I?" Emily chuckled softly, shaking her head. "There's no need to apologize. You had a lot on your mind. I get it." He nodded, but seemed to be searching for the right words. "It's just that I didn't realize how much I'd been holding back, I've spent so long pretending not to care about what people think. But I think deep down I did. I didn't know how to break out of that." "I think most people can relate to that," Emily said quietly. "It's hard to let go of the walls we build around ourselves even when we don't realize we're doing it." He nodded again, his expression thoughtful. "I spent so much time feeling like I had to be perfect, that I had to be what everyone expected me to be. But tonight, I feel like I can just be me." Emily smiled warmly. "And that's exactly who you need to be." There was a pause between them, a quiet understanding that passed without words. The young man, for the first time in a long while, felt seen, not as a project, not as someone to be fixed, but as a person. He had been allowed to exist on his own terms, and in that space he had found his voice. "So what now?" he asked, looking around the room. The night was almost over, and the guests were starting to make their way toward the exits. He didn't seem eager to leave, though. There was something in the air that felt different now, something that suggested this wasn't the end of his journey, but just the beginning. "Well," Emily said with a smile, "I think the night's still young, and besides, there's always time for one last dance." His eyes lit up, and for a moment the young man seemed to hesitate, almost as though the idea hadn't even crossed his mind. But then he looked at her, and there was a spark of something, a challenge maybe, or just the thrill of doing something unexpected. "I suppose I can't turn that down," he said, his voice teasing. Emily laughed. "I didn't think you would." Together they made their way back to the dance floor, and as the last song of the evening began to play, they found their rhythm again. This time there was no awkwardness, no hesitation. It was just two people enjoying the moment, connected by the simple act of moving together, of sharing something that felt timeless and true. As they danced, Emily noticed something else, the way people were looking at the young man. There were no more whispers, no more sidelong glances. Instead, people watched him with admiration, with respect. He had come into his own, not because of the money he inherited or the name he carried, but because he had allowed himself to be vulnerable, to step outside the expectations others had placed on him. He was no longer just the son of a billionaire. He was someone who had carved out his own place in the world. When the song ended, neither of them wanted to stop, but as the final notes faded away, the young man pulled back slightly, looking at Emily with a soft smile. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything. I don't think I would have gotten here without you." Emily shook her head, her smile genuine. "You were always here. You just needed a little nudge." The young man nodded as though the weight of her words settled deep within him. He had always known that he had more to offer the world, but it had taken someone else to help him see it, to give him the courage to step forward. As the night came to an end and the guests began to filter out, Emily and the young man shared one final look, a wordless acknowledgement of the quiet bond they had formed. She hadn't come to the gala expecting anything, and neither had he. But what had started as an evening of awkward glances and whispered judgments had turned into something far more meaningful, a moment of connection, a step toward breaking free from the walls they had built around themselves. The young man's journey had only just begun, but Emily knew one thing for certain. He would never again feel invisible, and neither would she. The weeks that followed the gala were a blur of change for the young man. His life, once a routine of charity events, meetings, and conversations where he barely felt present, began to shift in unexpected ways. The quiet confidence that had grown in him that night was still there, quietly working its way into every part of his life. He began to engage more with the people around him, speaking not just because it was expected, but because he had something to say. Emily, though she hadn't expected to become a part of his world, found herself swept into it in ways she hadn't imagined. They kept in touch after the gala, mostly through brief messages, the kind that people send when they want to check in but don't quite know how. Each message carried a sense of respect, a mutual understanding of the strange, silent connection they shared after that night. But over time, those messages grew longer. They talked more about life, about their individual struggles and triumphs, and even their silly little frustrations. What started as a quiet moment between two strangers had blossomed into a real friendship. One afternoon, several weeks later, Emily received a message from him. He wanted to meet. He didn't say much else, but the tone was different. There was a sense of urgency, an unspoken desire for something more. Emily agreed without hesitation. She was curious, yes, but also moved by how much he had changed. She wanted to see where this path would lead. They met at a quiet cafe in the corner of the city, a place neither of them had been to before. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow down, where the chatter of customers blended into the background, and the world outside felt distant. As Emily walked in, she immediately spotted him at a corner table. He was wearing a simple shirt and jeans, far more relaxed than the stiff suit he had worn at the gala. But it was more than just his clothes. There was a calm in his presence that hadn't been there before. He didn't seem like someone trying to fit in or hide behind his circumstances. He was just himself. When their eyes met, he stood up and smiled. It was the kind of smile that reached his eyes, genuine, unguarded, and full of warmth. Emily returned the smile, feeling a quiet sense of pride for the person he had become. "I'm glad you could make it," he said, his voice calm and steady. "I've been meaning to tell you something." Emily took a seat across from him, her curiosity piqued. "What's that?" He hesitated for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said the night of the gala. About finding my place. About not trying to fit into the mold that everyone else expects me to." Emily nodded, listening intently. "And? I think I finally figured out what that means," he continued, his gaze steady. "For the longest time, I thought my life was supposed to be about meeting expectations. About doing what was expected of me, whether I liked it or not. But after that night, after everything that happened, I realized that it doesn't have to be that way." He paused, as though trying to put the feelings into words. Emily could see the effort in his eyes, the way he was piecing it together. It wasn't just a realization. It was a shift, a deep and transformative understanding of who he was and what he could become. "I don't want to just be the blind son of a billionaire anymore," he said, his voice filled with determination. "I want to do something on my own. Something that's not defined by anyone else. Something that feels like me." Emily's heart swelled with pride. She had seen this growth, this quiet strength from the very first time they met. But now, in his words, she saw the full scope of it. He was no longer the person he had been, the person who hid behind his blindness, behind his family's wealth, and behind the walls he had built to protect himself. He had torn down those walls brick by brick, and in their place was a man who had found his own purpose. "Whatever you do," she said, her voice steady with support, "I know it will be incredible. You've got the heart for it." He smiled, but there was something more behind it this time, something deeper. "I don't know yet what it is," he admitted, "but I'm going to figure it out." The conversation moved to other topics: life, their shared experiences, the challenges they had faced, and the lessons they had learned. But the unspoken understanding lingered between them, an acknowledgement that this was more than just a casual conversation. It was a turning point, a moment of clarity for both of them. As the afternoon stretched into evening, the cafe became quieter, the light outside beginning to fade into dusk. It felt like the end of something and the beginning of something else. The young man stood up, pushing his chair back slowly. He seemed to hesitate for a moment, his hand resting on the table as though there was one more thing he wanted to say. "You know, I've never really thanked you for what you did," he said quietly, "for guiding me that night, for showing me that it's okay to be myself. It changed everything for me." Emily smiled, her heart full. "You didn't need to thank me. You did all the work. I just gave you a little push." But the young man shook his head. "No, it was more than that. It was your belief in me. That's what made all the difference." They stood there for a moment, just looking at each other. It wasn't a goodbye. It was an acknowledgement of how far they had both come, of the journey they had started that night and how much it had impacted both of them. As they stepped outside, the cool evening air greeted them. The streets of the city were still busy, but there was a sense of peace in the air, a quiet sense of possibility. Emily watched the young man for a moment, wondering where his path would take him. She knew, though, that whatever it was, he would face it with the same strength and resolve that had carried him through so much already. "Where do you go from here?" she asked softly, the question lingering in the cool air. He smiled, a little unsure but more confident than he had ever been. "I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out. I'm not afraid of it anymore." "Good," Emily said, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Because the world is waiting for you." The young man turned to her, his expression more open than she had ever seen it. "Thank you, Emily, for everything. For helping me see myself." She smiled in return, her heart full. "You did all the hard work. I just showed you where to start." And with that they parted ways, each of them carrying something from that day, a quiet, powerful understanding of what it meant to be truly seen, and the courage to step into the world as their authentic selves. The young man's journey had only just begun, but it was no longer a journey defined by expectations or fear. It was his journey, his path, and he would walk it with his head held high. And Emily, watching him disappear into the distance, knew that she had been part of something special, something that would stay with both of them forever. The night of the gala had been the beginning, but the true transformation had only just begun.